The twilight of Gondor was not a single moment, but a long dusk, stretched across centuries, where memory of kingship lingered, yet no king sat upon the throne. The white city still gleamed in the sun, her 7 walls stacked like steps to heaven, her towers white against the shadow of Mordor, but beneath that beauty was the fatigue of long wars, and a people grown weary of standing guard against a darkness that never fully receded. The lands around her grew thinner in strength, villages abandoned, farmland scarred, the Western allies gone to their own struggles. Gondor endured, but her endurance felt increasingly like defiance against fate, rather than triumph over it. Into this weary grandeur, 2 brothers were born. They were not sons of a king, but of a steward, for Gondor's throne had been empty for long generations. Denethor, their father, ruled as caretaker of a legacy that was not his to claim. He was brilliant and austere, gifted with keen sight into the minds of men, but that gift was also a burden, for he mistrusted easily and bore a pride that was brittle as stone. In such a house, Boromir and Faramir grew, 2 boys bound by blood, yet destined to bear the same inheritance in very different ways. Boromir, the elder, was fire given flesh. From his earliest days, he carried the weight of expectation with a natural ease. His arm was strong, his courage unshaken, and the men of Gondor already loved him before he was grown. He did not see Gondor's decline as inevitable. He saw it as something to be challenged, resisted, beaten back by strength of will and sharpened sword. His laughter rang bold in the halls, his spirit carried others with him, and his father's eye turned to him with a kind of pride that was fierce and demanding. Faramir was born different. Where Boromir shone like a banner in the wind, Faramir seemed to listen to the silence beneath the stones of Minas Tirith. He asked questions rather than issued commands. He listened to tales of old Númenor, and he sat often at Gandalf's side, eager to learn of lore and wisdom beyond war. His gaze fell not only on the battlements but on the stars above them, and though he carried a warrior's blade as capably as any, his heart leaned toward understanding rather than conquest. To Denethor this seemed weakness, though in truth it was a different kind of strength. Together they walked the streets of the city, brothers bound not only by kinship but by the sense that Gondor itself was a living thing they had inherited to protect. They saw her white stones worn by countless feet, her archives filled with scrolls that few now read, her armies mustering in the courts before riding east to wars that never ended. They felt, even as children, that they belonged not merely to a family but to a burden older than themselves, a burden that would someday rest heavier upon their shoulders than upon their fathers. For Gondor was not only a city of stone and banners, it was a memory of kingship preserved without kings. The stewards kept the realm in trust, sworn never to usurp the throne, but every year that the line of Isildur did not return, the stewardship became less trust and more rule. This paradox defined Denethor, and through him it shaped his sons. He taught them the glory of Gondor, but also the bitterness that no matter how valiantly they fought, they were not kings. Boromir sought to transcend this with deeds so mighty that no one could deny Gondor's greatness. Faramir accepted it with a quiet dignity, seeking wisdom in what could not be changed. Outside Gondor's walls, the shadow lengthened. The Dark Lord stirred again in Mordor, though none yet spoke of it too loudly. Orc raids increased along the Anduin harbors, felt the watch of black sails, and rumors spread of a great power rising once more in the east. Gondor stood against it, but each stand cost lives, each skirmish chipped away at strength that was not replenished. The line of defense stretched thinner, and always it was Boromir who sought to rally men with his unbreakable spirit. He fought as if sheer will could hold back the tide. But even in victory, there was a question that lingered. How long could one city endure alone? Boromir carried that question like a hidden wound. even as he smiled at soldiers and drank with captains. Faramir meanwhile sensed in dreams and whispers that Gondor's strength would not be enough by steel alone. He dreamt of far-off councils, of broken swords reforged, of voices speaking of the One Ring. He told Boromir, who dismissed such visions as shadows of sleep, that the seed was planted. Their paths would one day diverge, not in love, but in destiny. The people of Minas Tirith adored Boromir, yet they respected Faramir with a quieter reverence. Children followed Boromir with wooden swords, pretending to be captains at the front. Scholars nodded when Faramir paused to speak of old lore in the libraries. To the city, they were two halves of hope, though no one yet saw that one would be taken and the other left. Their bond was deep, yet their father's eyes always tilted the balance. Denethor looked to Boromir as heir in all but name, the embodiment of his own stern pride. To Faramir he gave little but suspicion, as though wisdom were a form of betrayal. This imbalance only bound the brothers tighter, for Boromir's love for Faramir was not lessened by their father's coldness. He defended him, encouraged him, and sought to bear the heavier share of their father's expectations, so his brother would not be crushed. Still the wound was there, silent and shaping. As Gondor's twilight deepened, the city's destiny began to pull the brothers apart. Boromir heard the call of duty in the east, in the clash of arms and the roar of battle. Faramir heard it in the west, in whispers of prophecy and dreams that stirred the hidden currents of fate. Both were true, and both were necessary. Gondor's fate would not be held by strength alone nor saved by wisdom in isolation. The tension between them would become the story of Gondor itself, how one brother's fall and the other's endurance could together shape the survival of a realm. The twilight of Gondor was not an ending, though many feared it was. It was a threshold, waiting for choices yet to come. In the halls of the steward, two brothers prepared in their own ways, for a fate neither could foresee clearly. Boromir sharpened his sword, laughed with soldiers, and promised that Gondor would never fall. Faramir walked the archives at night, traced the maps of forgotten kingdoms, and wondered whether Gondor's hope might come from beyond her walls. And so the stage was set, a city of white stone, a steward of brittle pride, and two brothers whose bond was strong enough to bear the weight of a kingdom's fate. Before we may understand how one would fall and the other would rise, we must first see how Denethor's shadow shaped them both. The shadow of Denethor fell long before his sons came to manhood. To those beyond his house, he was a figure of stern dignity, the steward who bore Gondor's burdens without faltering. Yet within the walls of his hall his presence was more formidable, a force that shaped the lives of Boromir and Faramir as surely as the weight of Gondor's crownless throne. Denethor was not unloving, but his love was bound to the measure of his own will. He prized strength, command, and obedience. He mistrusted softness, doubt, or any counsel that did not echo his own. Thus Boromir, whose nature matched his father's stern pride, found himself in the warm glow of approval, while Faramir, whose spirit sought other paths, stood often in the chill of disfavor. From their earliest days, Boromir felt the pressure of expectation and responded by excelling in all that Denethor demanded. He trained with the sword until his arms ached, drilled with captains twice his age, and spoke with a voice that carried the authority of a leader. His father's gaze followed him with silent satisfaction, and Boromir, though young, understood that he was the hope upon which Denethor rested Gondor's defense. To be loved was to be burdened, but Boromir accepted the burden gladly, for he adored his father and sought to prove himself worthy. Faramir, however, was cast in another mold. He learned the arts of battle no less diligently, and he bore a keen eye in archery and tactics. Yet his heart was not caught only by arms. He found solace in lore, in music, and in the tales of the West that Gandalf spoke when he visited the city. To Denethor, This breadth of spirit seemed like distraction, even weakness. The steward's approval was withheld, not always with cruelty, but with a coldness that spoke louder than any harsh word. A nod for Boromir was met with silence for Faramir. Praise for one was balanced with doubt for the other. The brothers felt this imbalance keenly. Boromir never ceased to honor Faramir's gifts, defending him when others whispered of his gentler heart. He admired his brother's wisdom, though he did not always share it. Faramir in turn looked to Boromir with admiration and love, never envying the affection his brother received, but quietly wishing his own worth might be seen in his father's eyes. Their bond deepened in this uneven soil, for each found in the other what their father could not give: unconditional loyalty. Denethor's nature had been shaped by long years of stewardship. He saw Gondor's decline clearer than most, and refused to soften the truth with hope. The throne was empty, the line of kings broken, and though he wore no crown, he ruled as one who must command without glory. That bitterness grew into pride, and pride into suspicion. He feared weakness in his sons because he feared it in Gondor itself. In Boromir he saw a bulwark against the world's decay. In Faramir he saw too much gentleness, a reflection of his own doubts, and so mistrusted him all the more. This judgment was not invisible to the boys. The captains of Gondor whispered of the elder son's prowess and the younger's hesitation. Boromir was cheered in the practice yards, his victories spoken of with pride in the taverns. Faramir was respected but not celebrated. His wisdom was admired in quiet corners, yet rarely raised in song. Such differences sank into their souls, not as rivalry but as fate. Each brother knew where he stood in his father's measure, and though love bound them, destiny seemed already to part them. In moments of quiet, Boromir would place a hand upon Faramir's shoulder and tell him not to mind their father's coldness. "The people will see your worth," he would say, "and I will see it always." Faramir would smile, grateful, but the wound lingered. No reassurance from his brother could fill the space left by a father's silence. Yet he did not grow bitter. Instead, he sought strength in other ways, in the study of old texts, in counsel with Gandalf, and in the patient endurance of a heart tempered by neglect. Denethor's shadow was not only personal, but political. He mistrusted allies, doubted tidings from afar, and watched the East with a gaze that saw only doom. His sons absorbed this outlook differently. Boromir took it as a challenge, to defy fate with valor and to prove Gondor still strong. Faramir saw it as a sorrow, a sign that Gondor's steward no longer believed in renewal, and that despair had crept too deeply into the marrow of the city. Each son then inherited not only their father's rule, but also his flaws: Boromir his pride, Faramir his sorrow. The brothers walked together often along the walls of Minas Tirith, looking out upon the Pelennor and beyond to the darkening east. Boromir spoke of strategies, of armies that could be raised, of blows that might yet be struck to hold Mordor at bay. His eyes burned with determination, and he carried himself as though no foe could stand before Gondor's will. Faramir listened, nodding, but his thoughts turned toward questions of meaning. He wondered whether strength alone could preserve their people, or whether another kind of courage, one of mercy, of wisdom, of restraint, might be required. In those walks the divergence of their paths was quietly foretold, though neither could yet see its end. Denethor rarely joined them on such walks. He remained in his high halls, poring over maps and reports, his mind always upon Gondor's peril, yet his absence was as shaping as his presence. For the boys grew accustomed to filling the silence between themselves. Boromir filled it with confidence, Faramir with reflection. Their companionship was a balm against the coldness of their father's regard. Still, there were moments when Denethor's affection broke through, though always toward Boromir. a clasp upon the shoulder, a rare smile when reports of battle were brought, a word of praise when Boromir's name was sung in the courts. Faramir watched such moments with a quiet ache. He did not begrudge his brother the love, but he longed for even a fragment of it. And in the absence of that recognition, he turned ever more to the wisdom of old tales, to the voices of those who believed that strength was not the only form of power. The shadow of Denethor lay across both their lives, not as a curse but as a shaping force. His stern pride gave Boromir his fire, and Faramir his gentleness, for even neglect can form character as surely as praise. The two brothers carried this weight differently, yet it bound them closer together. In Boromir's strength, Faramir found protection. In Faramir's wisdom, Boromir found balance. Yet the question remained, unspoken but ever present. When Gondor's greatest peril came, whose path would the steward trust? Would he turn to the son who mirrored his own stern pride, or to the one whose heart held truths he did not wish to see? That question lingered in the twilight air of Minas Tirith, a silent thread pulling toward choices yet to be made. And before it could be answered, we must turn to the office itself, to the burden of the stewardship that shaped both father and sons alike. The stewardship of Gondor was not merely a duty of governance, but a paradox inherited through centuries, to rule in the name of kings who never returned, to carry authority without crown, to bear power while always reminding the people that the true throne remained empty. In Denethor's time this burden pressed heavier than ever, for the shadow in the east grew, and the realm had thinned until its once great borders were but echoes of a lost empire. For Boromir and Faramir, the office of their house was not distant history, but the air they breathed. They grew within walls, steeped in that paradox, learning early that they were guardians of a memory as much as of a kingdom. The citadel bore this paradox in stone. The throne room, vast and echoing, was dominated not by a crown but by absence. At the far end rose the great chair of the kings, empty for long ages, covered in dust though still gleaming with ancient craft. Beside it stood the seat of the steward, smaller, humbler, set deliberately to one side, as if to remind all who entered the true kingship was not theirs to claim. Boromir, as a boy, had once asked why their father could not sit upon the great throne, for none else came forward to claim it. Denethor's reply had been sharp, that the thrones of kings are not to be usurped, and that the stewards rule only in trust. To Boromir that answer burned, for he saw his father laboring daily, and the pride within him longed to honor such toil with recognition. To Faramir the answer stirred a deeper thought, that stewardship itself was a form of sacrifice, a denial of glory for the sake of fidelity. From their earliest training, both sons were taught that they served not themselves but Gondor. The archives were opened to them, where dust lay thick upon scrolls recounting victories long past. They read of the line of Anarion, of the lost realm of Arnor in the north, of the glory of Númenor drowned in pride. These tales were not mere stories but warnings. Gondor had once been the high seat of men, yet now it stood as last defense against ruin. Boromir absorbed these lessons with martial fire. Gondor's past greatness demanded equal greatness in its defense. Faramir absorbed them with reflective sorrow. Gondor's decline spoke of a world where strength alone could not hold back decay. Both sought to serve the same city, yet they heard different calls in its ancient voice. The burden of stewardship was not only ceremonial, it was war without ceasing. Generations of stewards had stood against Mordor, against corsairs from the south, against wild men from the north, against famine and plague and the slow erosion of power. Victory was never permanent, only respite before the next storm. Denethor taught his sons this truth, though he offered it with bitterness. To him, the role of steward was both honor and chain. He knew he guarded a kingdom without hope of renewal, yet he refused to abandon it. This resignation gave his rule its stern quality, and it gave his sons the sense that their lives would be spent in the same unending struggle. Boromir took the lesson with eagerness. In the training yards, he fought with a zeal that matched the fiercest captains. He learned to rally men, to speak with the authority that made soldiers believe they could prevail even when outnumbered. Already, whispers spread that he was the mightiest warrior of Gondor in his generation. His victories in skirmishes along the borders earned him the people's love, and his presence was greeted with cheers in the streets. To him, the stewardship was a challenge to prove that Gondor still lived. The smaller seat beside the throne was not humiliation but a call to greater deeds. Faramir accepted the stewardship differently. He drilled with discipline, fought with skill, yet his heart lingered in the libraries and in council. He studied maps of ancient campaigns, learned the tongues of neighboring peoples, and spent long hours in thought. For him, the stewardship was not only a sword but a trust of wisdom. To endure without the crown was not defeat, but fidelity. To govern in humility was not weakness, but strength. Gandalf, seeing this, often lingered in his company, speaking to him of lore beyond the knowledge of men. This, too, shaped Faramir's sense of the stewardship, that it was not only a matter of keeping walls intact, but of keeping the spirit of Gondor unbroken. Yet Denethor's gaze fell more heavily upon Boromir. For every triumph of the elder, the father's approval was shown openly. For every insight of the younger, the father's acknowledgement was withheld. In the halls where the steward presided, it was clear who stood in the warmth of expectation and who lingered at the margins. The city itself seemed to mirror this. Songs of Boromir spread through taverns and camps, while Faramir's name was spoken quietly, with respect but without acclaim. This disparity did not weaken the bond between brothers, but it deepened the quiet wound within Faramir's heart. The paradox of stewardship thus lived in them both. They were heirs to power that was not theirs, guardians of a throne they could not ascend, defenders of a city fated to endure, but not to expand. The seat of their father carried weight without glory, command without kingship, burden without hope of release. Boromir sought to transform that burden into triumph through force of will. Faramir sought to endure it with humility and wisdom. Between them lay the tension of Gondor itself, striving both to defy doom and to accept limits. As the years turned, Denethor began to place greater responsibilities upon Boromir. The elder son was given command of companies, sent to lead raids against enemies pressing the borders, entrusted with the charge of defending Gondor's flanks. His name grew in renown, and though still young, he became the emblem of Gondor's defiance. Faramir remained in the background, serving faithfully, yet overshadowed. Still, he did not begrudge his brother. Instead, he supported him, offered counsel, and watched with quiet concern as Boromir's victories became ever more necessary to sustain Gondor's wavering hope. The stewardship, then, was not a relic of ancient oaths, but a living weight that pressed upon each of them. Boromir bore it with fire, Faramir with patience, and Denethor with pride turned to despair. The empty throne in the great hall stood always a silent witness, reminding them all that their rule was provisional, their victories temporary, their authority borrowed. Yet in that emptiness also lay the seed of possibility, that one day the line of kings might return. Few believed it, fewer still spoke of it, but Faramir dreamed of such a day, while Boromir believed Gondor could stand without it. Thus the paradox sharpened. Stewardship was both glory and grief, both mandate and futility. It was the soil in which two brothers grew, one striving to surpass, the other striving to endure. And as Boromir's first commands were given, and the people hailed him as Gondor's bulwark, The stage was quietly set for the deeper question. Could might alone preserve a realm built on memory? Or would another form of strength be required when Gondor's darkest hour arrived? Boromir's rise to renown was swift, for Gondor in those years leaned heavily upon the strength of her captains, and no captain was more celebrated than the steward's eldest son. From the first campaigns he commanded, his presence seemed to turn despair into fire. He led with a courage that refused retreat, with a voice that could lift weary men to strike again, and with a faith in Gondor's endurance that inspired belief even when the walls of the city trembled under assault. In taverns and barracks alike, his name was spoken with reverence. Boromir, son of Denethor, the people said, the bulwark of Gondor, the hammer of Mordor's servants. Yet glory was never simple. The victories he won came at great cost, and though his father praised him, Boromir felt the strain in every report of dwindling numbers, in every message that spoke of lost allies, in every face of a soldier buried in the stony soil of Ithilien. He laughed easily among his men, but in quiet moments he stared eastward and wondered how long Gondor could bleed without breaking. His strength was unquestioned, yet even the strongest arm could not be everywhere at once. Each skirmish seemed to buy time, not deliver safety. Each triumph seemed to postpone rather than resolve the peril. He fought upon the causeways of Osgiliath when Mordor's hosts pressed hard, and though the bridge was lost, it was Boromir who rallied the retreat and kept the city from falling entirely. He rode through the woods of Ithilien, driving back raiders and ambushes, striking swiftly and retreating before the great tide could engulf him. He stood at the walls of Caer Andros, holding the island fortress with a force too small for its task. Yet he refused to yield. Each deed was sung, each tale spread, and Boromir became a figure larger than life. To Gondor's people he was not merely Denethor's son, but Gondor herself embodied, fearless and unbowed. Denethor's pride in him grew. In the great hall, his gaze lingered on Boromir with approval that needed no words. To Faramir the contrast was plain, yet he bore it with patience, supporting his brother in all things. He saw, even before Boromir admitted it, that the very victories celebrated in the city were straining him to the breaking point. For every cheer there was also another demand, another expectation, another desperate plea for salvation. Gondor began to believe that as long as Boromir stood, the White City would never fall. But Boromir himself knew how thin the line had grown, and how perilous it was to rest the survival of a realm on one man's strength. He began to long for something more than mere reprieve. In councils he spoke of weapons that might turn the tide, of wonders or alliances that could deliver Gondor from this endless war of attrition. He did not speak idly. He had seen too much to believe valor alone would suffice. He dreamed of power great enough to break Mordor's will forever, a strength that could shatter armies rather than merely withstand them. In these thoughts Boromir's pride and desperation mingled, and though his heart was noble, the weight of Gondor's survival pressed him toward perilous longing. The people's adoration fed this hope. When Boromir returned from campaigns, the city's bells rang, and children ran through the streets with wooden swords, crying his name. Mothers blessed him for defending their sons. Old men saluted him as though he were already a king. He accepted their love with warmth, yet deep within he felt the contradiction sharpen. Gondor saw him as invincible, but he knew the truth that every victory came closer to the edge of ruin. Pride urged him to believe he might yet fulfill their faith. Desperation whispered that he must find some greater means. It was in this spirit that Boromir first heard Faramir speak of his dream. The younger son had seen in sleep a vision of Imladris, where a broken sword was reforged, and where a halfling bore a burden of immense peril. Faramir told it quietly, with the conviction of one who believes fate sometimes speaks in whispers. Boromir listened, but though he respected his brother, he was skeptical. Dreams could not defend walls, nor could lore slay orcs, yet the vision lingered. If some council was to be held far in the north, and if some weapon or hope might be found there, then perhaps Gondor's salvation lay not only in steel but in something greater. Denethor dismissed the dream when Faramir brought it before him, but Boromir, pressed by the weight of Gondor's need, began to wonder, for in his mind the thought grew that if any weapon of ancient power still existed, it should be brought to Minas Tirith. Gondor, the bulwark of men, deserved to wield it. He did not think of conquest for himself, but of deliverance for his city. He imagined an end to the long wars, an end to watching comrades fall, an end to the slow bleeding of the realm. In his heart, the motive was pure, yet the path it suggested was perilous, for the weapon of which whispers spoke was none other than the One Ring, and in it lay a power not meant for men to wield. Still, Boromir did not yet know the full nature of what he sought. He knew only that Gondor could not stand forever against Mordor's strength, and that valor alone would not suffice. His victories, though real, were like firebrands in a storm, brilliant for a moment, then swallowed by the wind. He longed for a flame that would not be extinguished, and thus, when word came that a council would indeed be held in Imladris, it was Boromir who rose, declaring that Gondor must be represented, that he would go himself to learn what hope might be found. Denethor did not forbid him, for he trusted Boromir's judgment, and perhaps secretly believed that if any boon could be gained, it would be his eldest son who would win it. In the days before his departure, Boromir walked once more through the streets of Minas Tirith. The people cheered him, though they did not yet know the journey he would take. He looked upon the great walls and the white tower, upon the empty throne and the smaller seat beside it, and he vowed silently that he would find some means to secure Gondor's survival. He thought not of himself, but of his people, of the city that had raised him, of the burden that pressed upon his father and would one day rest fully upon him. If fate offered a weapon, he would seize it for Gondor's sake. Yet in that vow was already the seed of his fall, though he could not see it. For in seeking strength to preserve his people, he risked mistaking power for salvation. And as he set his eyes northward, toward the hidden valley where the council awaited, the question lingered like an unspoken breath. If Boromir fought to save his city with all his might, what path would remain for Faramir, whose heart was turned to wisdom rather than to conquest? Faramir's nature unfolded quietly, like the slow dawn that softens the outlines of a shadowed land, while Boromir's presence was a trumpet that roused men to action. Faramir's was a steady flame that comforted and endured. He walked among the soldiers of Ithilien with calm words, asking after their families, remembering their names, and listening with the patience of one who valued more than obedience. His men followed him not only out of duty but out of love, for they knew he would not spend their lives carelessly. This was not weakness but a strength born of empathy, and though Denethor mistrusted it, Gondor's captains came to understand its worth. He had always turned toward wisdom as naturally as his brother had turned toward battle. In the libraries of Minas Tirith he lingered among the scrolls when Boromir was at the training yards. He traced the histories of Númenor, not with idle curiosity but with a reverence for what they revealed of pride, downfall, and the cost of ambition. He spoke often with Gandalf when the Grey Pilgrim visited, and in those long conversations he learned that wisdom could be as sharp as any sword, though it cut more subtly and often healed as much as it wounded. Gandalf saw in him a rare gift, the ability to hold both strength and gentleness in balance, to see through the surface of events to the deeper currents beneath. Dreams touched him as well. Unlike Boromir, who dismissed such things as vagaries of sleep, Faramir felt their weight. He dreamt of a broken sword reforged, of a voice calling from Imladris, of a halfling bearing a burden of fire. He shared these visions, not with pride, but with quiet conviction, believing they were fragments of fate entrusted to him. Denethor turned cold at such words, calling them folly, but Faramir did not waver. He believed that destiny sometimes whispered through the veils of sleep, and that to ignore such whispers was to walk blind into darkness. His gentleness, however, came at a cost. Denethor saw in it not strength but softness, and judged him by the standards he reserved for Boromir. The younger son's wisdom was treated as hesitation, his patience as weakness, his mercy as defiance. Faramir endured his father's judgment without rebellion, for he loved Denethor, despite the coldness. Yet each dismissal left a scar. Where Boromir thrived under approval, Faramir learned resilience under disfavor, and that resilience deepened the humility at the heart of his character. He bore insult without bitterness, yet the ache remained, shaping him into a man who sought worth not in his father's eyes but in the truth he discerned for himself. When he came of age, Faramir was given command of Gondor's rangers. Unlike the great companies Boromir led in open battle, the rangers fought in secrecy and shadow. They moved through the woods of Ithilien, harassing enemy supply lines, striking swiftly and vanishing like wraiths into the green gloom. It was a different war, one of patience, silence, and endurance. Faramir excelled here, for he understood that not every battle could be won by direct confrontation. In ambush and watchfulness he found a rhythm that suited him, and his men grew fiercely loyal. They knew their captain would not waste them in vain glory. Yet his service was marked always by contrast. Where Boromir returned to Minas Tirith with tales sung of his valor, Faramir's victories were whispered of quietly, his deeds known only to those who had stood with him in the wild. He did not envy his brother, for he loved him deeply, but he could not help but see the difference. When they met again in the city, Boromir was greeted with banners, while Faramir's return passed almost unnoticed. He bore it without complaint, for his heart sought not acclaim but truth. This truth revealed itself most clearly in his restraint. He had the chance to seize the ring when fate delivered Frodo and Sam into his hands. Gondor needed hope, and he knew what such an object represented. Yet when he looked upon it, he saw not salvation but destruction. He felt the temptation as any man must, yet he refused. To him, the ring was not a gift but a test, and in his refusal he revealed a strength deeper than any Boromir could muster with sword in hand. He chose the harder path, to let the halflings go, knowing his father would despise the decision, knowing Gondor would remain vulnerable, yet trusting that mercy and faithfulness were stronger foundations than grasping at forbidden power. This act of refusal was not sudden, but born of years of character. It came from the patience he had learned under Denethor's coldness, from the humility nurtured in obscurity, from the wisdom drawn from Gandalf's counsel and Númenor's histories. It was the flowering of a life shaped not by approval but by endurance. And though his father would call it weakness, it was in truth a greater strength than Boromir's boldest victories. His relationship with Boromir was the heart that sustained him. The elder brother never ceased to defend him, to shield him from the full brunt of Denethor's scorn. Boromir's pride in him was unshaken, and their love was mutual. Yet even here, the difference between them grew clearer. Boromir longed for a power that could deliver Gondor from endless war. Faramir trusted that true strength lay not in grasping but in surrendering what was never theirs to wield. They did not quarrel, but the divergence of their paths was undeniable. Boromir believed Gondor could not stand without the ring. Faramir believed Gondor would not stand if it took it. Both sought to save their people, yet each saw salvation by a different light. It was this contrast that would define them, for in Faramir's restraint lay the hidden salvation of Gondor, though none could yet see it. Boromir's zeal would lead to his fall, yet his sacrifice would also give Gondor time. Faramir's wisdom would preserve what Boromir's strength could not. Two brothers, bound by love, divided by fate, each carrying a different fragment of Gondor's truth. And so Faramir's story deepened in silence. He remained the quiet watcher, the dreamer who walked among ruins and whispered of hope that was not yet visible. His strength was not sung in the streets, but it was etched in the hearts of those who served him. He bore the stewardship not with the fire of conquest, but with the endurance of faith. And though Denethor scorned him, and though Gondor's people looked first to Boromir, it would one day be Faramir's hand that turned the city from ruin to renewal. Yet before that day, Gondor's fate would pass through fire, and as Boromir journeyed north to the council in Imladris, seeking weapons of deliverance, the question remained, what would happen when wisdom and desperation, restraint and zeal were tested against the same peril? The long road north carried Boromir far from the white stones of Minas Tirith into lands he had never seen, a journey pressed upon him by desperation and the weight of Gondor's need. He rode alone, bearing his shield and horn, passing through leagues of wilderness, where the ruins of old kingdoms lay broken under ivy and moss. Few men of Gondor had ever ventured so far in living memory, for the steward's realm had been bound to its own walls for generations. But Boromir pressed onward, driven by the dream that had haunted Faramir and by his own conviction that some hope must yet be found beyond Gondor's borders. Each night, when the stars stretched wide and unmeasured, he thought of the city he had left behind, of its white tower gleaming against the shadow of Mordor, and he vowed he would not return without some gift of salvation. The road was perilous, and more than once he fought off wild men or fled the howls of wolves in the hills. His horse carried him tirelessly, and his will never faltered, though his body grew lean and weathered. It was not merely a test of endurance, but of faith, for each step northward seemed to demand that he believe Gondor's fate might yet be shifted by something more than war. He thought often of Faramir's dream, and though he had once doubted it, he came to see the journey itself as proof that dreams sometimes bore the weight of destiny. At last he came to Imladris, the hidden valley of Elrond, where the green woods opened into a place untouched by the weariness of the world. The council was gathered there, and Boromir entered it, not as a suppliant, but as Gondor's voice. He spoke with the authority of one who carried his city upon his shoulders, and the others listened, for though they knew him not, the fire in his eyes and the strength in his bearing commanded respect. He told of Mordor's growing power, of Gondor's thin defenses, of Osgiliath nearly fallen, of the tireless watch his people had kept while the rest of the world slept in uneasy peace. His words rang with urgency, for he wanted them to understand that Gondor was not only a realm in decline, but the very wall between darkness and the free peoples of Middle-earth. It was then that he heard what he had half suspected but never dared to name aloud. The One Ring, the master of them all, had been found, and it lay in the keeping of a small hobbit who sat quietly among the council. Boromir's heart leapt at once, not with greed for himself, but with the vision of what the ring might accomplish if brought to Minas Tirith. He saw Arm turned back, the hosts of Mordor shattered, the Dark Lord himself undone. He saw Gondor renewed, no longer a realm of weary defense, but of victory and restoration. In his mind, it was not theft or folly, but rightful destiny. For had not Gondor borne the burden longer than any? Was it not just that the weapon of the enemy be used to end the very war that consumed them? Others spoke against it, Elrond wise and grave, reminding the Council of the Ring's corrupting power, Gandalf warning that no man, however noble, could wield it without being unmade. Aragorn, too, the hidden heir of kings, spoke with quiet authority, though his words carried a weight Boromir did not yet accept. To him, Aragorn was but another chieftain cloaked in old lineage, untested against Mordor's fire. What Gondor needed was not the return of a king, but strength here and now. Boromir listened, but his mind wrestled with the thought that they would cast aside the one chance to deliver Gondor from endless siege. The council chose otherwise. The ring was not to be used, but to be destroyed, and a fellowship was formed to bear it into Mordor. Boromir was chosen among them, for his voice had been loudest, and his presence could not be denied. He accepted, though not with peace in his heart, for he could not reconcile himself to the thought of such power being wasted when Gondor bled daily. Yet he vowed he would serve faithfully, believing still that perhaps on the road a clearer purpose would reveal itself. In those first days of the fellowship, he proved himself stalwart and kind. He carried burdens without complaint, guarded the hobbits with protective care, and showed the same warmth he had always given his men in Gondor. Merry and Pippin adored him, drawn to his bold laughter and his easy camaraderie. He taught them to handle their swords, not with condescension but with genuine affection, as though they were younger brothers. Even in this, the nobility of his heart shone clear. Boromir was never a tyrant, but a leader who loved those under his care. Yet beneath his warmth, the question gnawed at him. Each night, as the fire burned low, he thought of Minas Tirith's walls, of his father's stern face, of Faramir walking the woods of Ithilien, and he asked himself how he could return empty-handed. The ring seemed less like a burden and more like an answer denied. He watched Frodo closely, not with malice, but with a deepening conviction that the halfling carried Gondor's salvation unawares. He struggled within himself, torn between loyalty to the Fellowship and duty to his city. There were moments when Aragorn's quiet presence stung him most, for in Aragorn he saw not only a rival but a living reminder of the paradox of stewardship. Here was the heir of kings, hidden in plain sight, walking with the humility of a ranger, yet carrying the authority of a crown. To Boromir it seemed unfair that fate would place Gondor's destiny in such uncertain hands. His heart wrestled with pride and doubt, for though he respected Aragorn's strength, he could not accept that Gondor's salvation lay in the return of a king, rather than in the weapons of men already tested. The council had determined the course, yet Boromir's heart remained restless. He was caught between faithfulness to the Fellowship and the pull of Gondor's desperate need. His nobility drove him to protect, to guide, to serve, yet his desperation whispered that to seize the ring was not betrayal, but the highest loyalty, the ultimate act of sacrifice for his people. He told himself it was not for his own glory but for Gondor's survival. In this conviction lay both his greatness and his peril, for the line between selfless duty and fatal pride is thin, and Boromir walked it with every step the Fellowship took. Thus the path that began in Imladris carried with it the weight of doom. Boromir was noble, valiant, beloved, and yet already touched by the shadow of temptation. And as he marched with the Fellowship through snow and shadow, he carried within him both Gondor's hope and Gondor's peril. The question lingered, quiet as a whisper in the night. How long could a man bear the nearness of the ring before duty and desire became indistinguishable? The Fellowship's road wound on, carved through cold mountains and deep forests, through halls of stone and across plains where the wind carried whispers of war. Among them Boromir walked as both shield and shadow, strong in arm, yet troubled in heart. He had pledged to guard the halflings, and he did so with warmth that none could doubt. Yet always his gaze drifted to Frodo, and in Frodo's small burden he saw not only danger but the answer to Gondor's long despair. The ring was never spoken of openly, but it lay between them like a hidden fire, drawing his thoughts back again and again, until even moments of laughter were tinged with unease. At times his nobility shone without cloud. When the snows of Caradhras threatened to bury them, he lifted hobbits in his arms and broke paths through the drifts, his voice carrying encouragement above the howl of the storm. When danger pressed from the east, he stood guard through the night without complaint, his horn across his knee, his eyes ever watchful. He loved his companions, and his care was not feigned. Merry and Pippin clung to him as elder brothers might cling to one who shields them. Aragorn, though often in quiet conflict with him, respected his courage and relied on his strength. None doubted that Boromir's heart was valiant, yet within that valiance stirred an unrest that could not be stilled, for the ring worked subtly, not only upon the mind of its bearer, but upon all who drew near it. It did not always speak in words, but in suggestions clothed as duty. For Boromir, its whisper was not of personal glory, but of Gondor's salvation. In his waking hours, he told himself he sought only to serve. In his dreams, however, he saw the white city crowned in victory, its banners streaming, its walls restored, its people free of fear, and in each vision, the ring blazed at the center, wielded by his own hand. He woke from such dreams with sweat upon his brow, ashamed yet unable to dismiss them. Aragorn's presence became a quiet thorn. He admired the ranger's strength, yet could not shake the sense that Aragorn withheld too much, that he carried secrets in silence while Gondor's plight grew worse by the day. In Boromir's eyes, it seemed arrogance that Aragorn, heir of kings, would not claim openly what he was. Each time Aragorn counseled patience, each time he reminded them of Elrond's charge, Boromir heard not wisdom but delay. To him delay was death, for every day Gondor bled on the frontier. The contrast between them grew sharper as the journey pressed on, though it never abutted into open quarrel. Instead, it lingered as tension in the spaces between words, a divergence of paths that seemed destined to break. The hobbits felt none of this shadow. To them, Boromir was a friend who laughed loudly, who taught them to parry with wooden sticks, who spoke fondly of his city with pride glowing in his eyes. He told them of Minas Tirith's towers, of the markets filled with color, of the sound of the bells echoing from stone to stone at dawn. They listened wide-eyed, comforted by his certainty that Gondor was strong and beautiful. They did not see the doubt gnawing beneath his words, nor hear the unspoken fear that without some new strength, the white city would fall. For their innocence he loved them all the more, wishing that such simplicity could endure. But the burden of the fellowship deepened as they drew nearer to Mordor. Each night the ring seemed to weigh more heavily upon Frodo, and each night Boromir's thoughts turned with greater intensity to the peril of letting such a weapon slip through their grasp. The words of Elrond and Gandalf echoed in him, warnings of corruption, of ruin, but he asked himself whether such fears were not themselves a form of cowardice. Could it not be that the ring, though perilous, was meant for salvation? Was it not better to risk corruption than to surrender all to the enemy? In these quiet arguments with himself, the line between loyalty and temptation grew thin. When he spoke aloud, his words were still clothed in reason. "We cannot forever run from Mordor," he said once, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "We must face it with strength. Gondor has stood against it for centuries. With the ring in our hands, we might strike as never before." Aragorn answered him firmly, reminding him of Elrond's command, yet Boromir's eyes smoldered with the pain of being dismissed. He did not rage, for he still honored Aragorn as comrade, but the fire of conviction burned ever hotter within him. There were moments when Frodo felt his gaze and trembled, not in hatred but in unease. For Boromir loved him too, and that love warred with the desire to take from him what he carried. It was the tragedy of Boromir that his temptation was born not of greed, but of devotion. He saw Frodo's small frame staggering under a weight far beyond his measure, and thought, how can such a burden be trusted to one so slight, when Gondor, mighty and desperate, has need of? His compassion turned upon itself, bending into peril, until even mercy could no longer shield him from doubt. The ring fed upon that doubt, offering visions in silence. He saw himself standing in Minas Tirith, horn raised, the armies of Mordor breaking against his might. He saw Denethor's eyes at last softened with pride, unclouded by fear. He saw Faramir beside him, not overshadowed but radiant, sharing in victory. He saw the White City no longer a place of twilight, but reborn in glory. In these visions he believed he fought not for himself but for all his people. The ring twisted duty into desire, until the two were indistinguishable. And so the fellowship, bound together in trust, carried within it the seed of fracture. Boromir laughed, guarded, lifted, encouraged, yet beneath his noble bearing, the struggle grew. He was a man divided, caught between love for his companions and the desperate conviction that they walked blindly past Gondor's one chance of survival. He longed to serve, yet the path of service and the path of temptation were no longer clear. Each step brought them nearer to the hour when his heart would be forced to choose. Thus the fellowship marched, outwardly united, inwardly strained. Boromir's nobility and unrest grew side by side, twin fires burning toward inevitable convergence. He was no villain, but a man too deeply bound to his people's plight, a man whose greatest virtue was also the root of his peril. The road carried them onward, yet within Boromir's soul, a darker road had already begun, and it led inexorably toward the forested slopes where choice would no longer be deferred, and where strength and weakness would prove to be the same. The forest of Amon Hen lay heavy with silence, its trees tall and watchful, as though they bore witness to fates being woven in their shadowed canopy. The fellowship, wearied by long miles and shadowed by doubt, had scattered among the glades to find a moment's rest before deciding their road. Frodo had withdrawn in solitude, bearing his burden alone as he had so often desired, while Boromir paced the forest floor, torn between loyalty and temptation, between love for his companions and desperation for his city. It was here, in the hush of rustling leaves, that the struggle within him reached its breaking point. For days, the thoughts had grown heavier. Gondor cried out in his heart, its walls pressed by Mordor, its people weary, its steward consumed by pride and despair. Boromir saw in every step the futility of endless retreat. To him, the journey seemed not toward salvation, but toward abandonment, carrying Gondor's one chance of deliverance further from her gates with each mile. The ring was near, and with it, a vision of victory so vivid, it consumed his waking mind. He told himself it was not for glory, not for power, but for the survival of all that he loved. In this conviction, his will bent, and the whisper of the ring became indistinguishable from the voice of duty. He found Frodo alone, seated upon a stone, his face pale with weariness, his eyes haunted by the burden none could share. Boromir approached with gentleness at first, his voice steady, his words cloaked in reason. He spoke of Gondor's plight, of the strength they lacked, of the salvation that lay within Frodo's grasp, if only he would yield it to a hand willing to wield it. His tone was not harsh but pleading, as though he asked for mercy rather than for power. Frodo listened in silence, his heart heavy with pity, for he saw that Boromir's love for his people was true, yet his words were already bent by the ring's corruption. As Frodo refused, the plea sharpened into insistence, and insistence into demand. Boromir's hand reached out, trembling, his face alight with both desperation and conviction. In that moment, the noble captain of Gondor, beloved of his people, stood as a man undone, his strength warped into peril. Frodo fled from him, vanishing under the ring's power, leaving Boromir alone among the trees, his cry of anguish echoing through the forest like a horn blown in despair. He fell to his knees, the weight of shame crashing upon him. He saw in sudden clarity that he had been deceived, that he had sought to grasp what was never his to claim, He wept not only for himself but for Gondor, for his father, for his brother, for the fellowship he had broken. Yet fate gave him no time for long repentance. Even as he wept, the sound of orc horns rose in the distance, harsh and clamorous, and the forest shuddered under their tread. Boromir rose, seizing his sword, and ran toward the cries of Merry and Pippin. His fall had been swift, but swifter still was his redemption, for he did not flee into darkness, but hurled himself into battle for the smallest of his companions. The orcs came upon them in a tide, cruel and relentless, yet Boromir stood as a wall of defiance, his horn sounding clear through the woods. Again and again he struck them down, his blade flashing, his voice thundering, his body a barrier between innocence and slaughter. The battle raged, and arrows pierced him, yet he fought on. A shaft struck his shoulder, another his side, but still he lifted his sword. The hobbits cried out, terrified yet unwilling to leave him, and Boromir shielded them with his body. Driving back wave after wave, his strength began to fail, yet his spirit blazed brighter with each wound. He had fallen to temptation, but now he rose in sacrifice, pouring out his life not for glory or for Gondor's pride, but for the helpless at his side. At last, the arrows became too many. His knees gave way, his sword fell from his hand, and the orcs dragged Merry and Pippin into the shadows, their cries fading into the forest. Boromir lay upon the ground, his horn broken beside him, his chest heaving with ragged breath. Blood stained the grass, yet his eyes still burned with the fire of one who had not yielded entirely to despair. It was there that Aragorn found him, too late to save but in time to witness. Their meeting was heavy with sorrow. Boromir, his voice broken yet clear, confessed his failure. He spoke of his attempt to take the ring, of his fall into temptation, his shame at betraying the trust of the fellowship. Yet he spoke also of his battle, of the hobbits taken, of his desperate attempt to shield them. Aragorn knelt beside him, tears in his eyes, not condemning but honoring, for he saw in Boromir not only the failure of a man but the greatness of one who had turned even his fall into a gift. In his last breaths, Boromir looked to Aragorn not as rival but as king. He told him that Gondor would need him, that the White City must not fall, that Aragorn must claim the throne he had long denied. In those words Boromir surrendered not only his life but his pride, offering Gondor's fate into hands he had once resisted. It was the final act of a man who, though undone by temptation, found in death the redemption of humility. His eyes closed and the forest fell silent but for the weeping of his companions. Boromir's fall at Amon Hen was both ruin and gift. He died with arrows in his body and shame upon his heart, yet his sacrifice saved the fellowship from destruction, and his final words bound Aragorn to the path of kingship. His death was not in vain, for though the ring had broken his resolve, it could not extinguish the love that had driven him all his life, love for Gondor, for his brother, for his people. In him, strength and weakness had become the same, a paradox that revealed the tragedy and nobility of men. The forest of Amon Hen kept his secret, holding both his fall and his redemption in its shadowed memory. The fellowship, now sundered, carried with it the weight of his loss, each in their own way. Aragorn bore the charge to protect Gondor, Frodo bore the deeper burden of isolation, and Faramir, though he did not yet know it, would bear the sorrow of a brother fallen, and the legacy of one whose death would define his own path. So ended Boromir's road, not in triumph, not in failure, but in the quiet mingling of both. And as the river bore his body away beneath the sky of Middle-earth, the question turned toward Gondor's walls. What would become of the brother who remained when his turn came to face the same temptation? Far from the slopes of Amon Hen, where Boromir's body drifted upon the river in solemn silence, Faramir walked the green woods of Ithilien with his rangers. The air was thick with the scent of leaves and earth, the hush of streams running unseen, the calls of hidden birds among the boughs. Yet beneath the beauty of that land lay shadow, for Ithilien was no longer Gondor's garden, but a frontier between light and dark. It was Faramir's charge to defend it. Though his men were few and his resources thin, he did not seek glory in this task. His war was one of patience and silence, of striking swiftly and vanishing before Mordor's hosts could crush them. In every ambush, every raid, every long night of waiting, he embodied the restraint his brother had lacked, though his heart carried no less love for Gondor. Faramir was captain now, not only of soldiers, but of the silence that sustained them. He moved with them as one, eating sparingly, keeping vigil by their fires, bearing the same hardships as the lowliest of his men. They loved him not as one distant, but as a leader who shared their burden. They said of him that he could look into a man's eyes and know both his fear and his courage, and he judged neither harshly. He knew well that valor was not always in the stroke of a sword, but sometimes in the endurance of a weary heart. This patience made him different from Boromir, who had burned with restless zeal. Yet in that difference lay the hidden strength Gondor would need. It was in Ithilien that Faramir's path crossed with the ring, though he knew it not at first. His rangers captured 2 halflings, small folk unlike any they had seen, wandering where few dared tread. With them came whispers of a strange guide, thin and twisted, lurking in the shadows like a creature half born of light and darkness. Faramir questioned them with kindness, but also with severity, for the times allowed no recklessness. He had learned caution in a land where every stone might conceal an enemy, every shadow might bear a knife. Yet as he listened to Frodo and Sam, he discerned truth in their words, and in Frodo's eyes he saw a burden greater than any mortal should bear. In that moment Faramir's heart was tested as Boromir's had been, for the ring lay near, though veiled, and its presence pressed upon him like a whisper in the leaves. Gondor's need was desperate, his father's judgment cold, his brother lost beyond recall. Would it not be mercy, he thought, to take this burden from a halfling's shoulders and bear it himself? Would it not be duty to carry such a weapon to Minas Tirith, to place it in the hands of Gondor's steward, to wield it in defense of the city? The temptation was real, and he felt its weight. Yet unlike Boromir, he did not reach for it. For Faramir had long prepared for such a test. Though he had not known it, he had lived under Denethor's disfavor, and in that furnace had learned that worth was not proved by grasping after what was denied. He had studied the histories of Númenor, and in those drowned annals had seen how pride brought ruin to the mighty. He had listened to Gandalf, who spoke often of humility and of power that destroys its wielder, and he had endured his brother's absence, feeling always the weight of Boromir's fire beside his own quieter flame. From these strands he wove the strength to refuse. "I would not take this thing," he said, when at last the truth was revealed. His words were firm, though his men looked at him with astonishment. Not if it lay by the highway, not were Minas Tirith falling in ruin and my father upon his knees, for I know the danger of it. In those words he revealed the heart of his strength, not the denial of Gondor's peril, but the acceptance that some weapons bring only greater ruin. His men obeyed without question, for their loyalty to him was deep, though in their hearts some wondered. Yet Frodo and Sam looked upon him with awe, for in his refusal lay their salvation. They knew well what Boromir had attempted, and in Faramir's restraint they saw a mirror turned the other way. It was not that he loved Gondor less, but that he loved it more truly, seeing that its survival could not be bought at the price of its soul. Still, his choice carried cost. He knew what his father would say, that Denethor would call him weak, a traitor to Gondor's desperate need. He felt that shadow even in the moment of his nobility. Yet he bore it, for he had long since learned that Denethor's voice was not the voice of truth. He thought of Boromir, and sorrow pierced him. He did not yet know his brother's fate, but in his heart he feared it. He prayed that Boromir had not been undone by the same temptation he himself had resisted. In Ithilion's green shadows, the contrast between the brothers was written into fate. Boromir had reached, believing he served, and fallen. Faramir refused, believing he must endure, and was preserved. Both choices were born of love, both of duty, yet one ended in ruin, the other in redemption. In them Gondor's divided heart was revealed. Pride and humility, zeal and patience, strength and restraint. And though neither choice was without sorrow, together they formed a whole, as if fate had set the brothers side by side to teach Gondor where her salvation must be sought. The hobbits left Ithilien with gratitude, bearing onward their impossible task. Faramir watched them go, his rangers at his side, the wind stirring the leaves. He knew he had let slip a weapon beyond imagining, and he knew the scorn that would follow when word reached his father. Yet he felt no regret. His heart was quiet, for he believed that mercy was stronger than conquest, and that Gondor's hope lay not in seizing power, but in enduring with honor. Still, the shadow lengthened. Mordor stirred, and the drums of war beat ever louder across the plain. Faramir knew that his test was not ended, that greater trials awaited him. Yet in that quiet moment he stood as the silent guardian of Gondor's true strength. Where Boromir's horn had sounded in defiance, Faramir's silence carried equal power, for it was the silence of refusal, the strength of one who will not yield even to the greatest temptation. Thus the captain of Ithilien passed his trial, not in the blaze of battle but in the hidden choice of the heart. And as he turned back into the woods with his men, his face solemn, his step steady, the story of the brothers grew deeper. For Boromir's fall had revealed Gondor's peril, but Faramir's refusal revealed Gondor's salvation. And the tale now turned toward Minas Tirith, where Denethor's shadow awaited, and where the burden of both sons would soon converge upon the city's fate. When Faramir returned from Ithilien to Minas Tirith, weary from the long march and shadowed by the burden of his choice, the white city loomed before him in all its fading majesty. Its 7 walls rose tier upon tier, still gleaming in the light of the sun, yet to Faramir they seemed heavy with the weariness of centuries. The bells tolled faintly, and banners stirred in the wind, but the air carried little joy. Gondor was bracing for war, and her people whispered in dread, as rumors of the enemy's growing strength crept into every street. Faramir entered through the gates, not as a returning hero, but as a captain bearing tidings his father would not wish to hear. Denethor sat in his hall, stern upon the steward's chair, his face gaunt with long care, his eyes sharp with restless fire. The great throne of kings stood empty beside him, as it had for uncounted years, and in that emptiness Faramir felt the weight of all Gondor's sorrow. Denethor welcomed him without embrace, his voice measured, his gaze penetrating. Faramir reported faithfully of the skirmishes in Ithilien, of the growing press of Mordor's strength, and at last of the halflings and their burden. He told his father plainly that he had let them go, trusting their errand though it led away from Gondor's desperate need. The hall grew cold at his words. Denethor's face hardened, his eyes burning with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "So," he said, his voice cutting through the chamber like steel, "you had within your grasp a weapon that might have saved Gondor, and you let it pass beyond your reach. You saw the chance of deliverance, and you spurned it. Weakness has guided your hand, as it has always guided your heart." His words struck like blows, and though Faramir stood tall, he felt the old wound reopen. The wound of a father's disfavor, sharpened now into accusation. Faramir answered with quiet steadiness, though his heart ached. He spoke of the peril of the ring, of how it could not be wielded without destroying its bearer, of how even Boromir, beloved and mighty, had fallen into its temptation. At that name, Denethor's face twisted, grief and bitterness mingling. Boromir was gone, though word of his death had not yet come to the steward's ear, and in Denethor's heart the absence of his eldest son had already deepened into obsession. He clung to Boromir as the embodiment of his pride, the proof of his own strength, the heir who reflected his own fire. In comparison, Faramir seemed always a shadow, too gentle, too yielding, too unlike the iron will Denethor prized. "Boromir would not have failed me," Denethor said, his voice rising with grief disguised as wrath. "He would have brought the weapon to Minas Tirith. He would have seen its power used to break our enemies. He was loyal where you are weak. He was bold where you are cautious. He was the son I needed, while you—" He broke off, yet the unspoken words hung heavy in the air, more cruel than any spoken judgment. Faramir bowed his head, not in shame but in sorrow, for he loved his father still, though his love was unreturned. Yet though the pain cut deep, Faramir did not falter. He held to his conviction, knowing that to seize the ring would have been Gondor's undoing, that his refusal had been Gondor's hidden salvation. But Denethor would not see it. His pride had become a blindness, his grief a fire that consumed reason. He looked upon his younger son not with gratitude but with disdain, unable to perceive the nobility that shone in Faramir's refusal. Thus was the gulf between them widened, and the shadow of their house deepened. Among the captains of Gondor, murmurs spread. Some sided with Denethor, believing that Faramir had been too gentle, too trusting, too willing to let hope slip through his fingers. Others saw the wisdom in his choice, though they dared not speak it openly in the steward's hall. Faramir bore their doubts with patience, for he did not seek vindication. He sought only to serve Gondor with honor, even if unrecognized. Yet the wound of his father's scorn weighed upon him more heavily than the armor he wore. In the days that followed, Mordor's shadow pressed nearer. The skies darkened with storm, and scouts brought tidings of armies massing on the plain. The drums of war could almost be felt through the stone of the city. Denethor grew restless, pacing his halls, his eyes turned often to the east, as though seeking in the distance some sign of doom. He trusted little counsel but his own, and the Palantir, hidden in his keeping, fed him visions that deepened his despair. To him Gondor seemed already abandoned, her allies uncertain, her king absent, her fate sealed in ruin. In such darkness he clung all the more to Boromir's memory. And in that clinging, Faramir's presence became to him a bitter reminder of all that had been lost. Still, Faramir endured. He walked among his men, speaking gently, strengthening them, reminding them that Gondor had stood long and must stand still. They loved him for this, even as Denethor dismissed him. He did not speak against his father, for his loyalty was unbroken, but he carried within him the quiet sorrow of one who bears both burden and rejection. His brother's absence weighed heavily, and though he did not yet know the truth, his heart feared what it would hear. When at last tidings came that Boromir had fallen, carried by Aragorn and the others who had been with him, the grief in Minas Tirith was profound. Yet even then, Denethor's love for his eldest became a fire turned against his surviving son. Boromir, he cried, my pride, my joy, my hope of Gondor. You are gone, and I am left with one who brings me only sorrow." These words pierced Faramir, yet he did not answer with anger. He bore them silently, as he had borne all wounds, turning his sorrow into endurance. Thus Faramir's refusal of the ring became not only his own trial, but the measure of his father's disdain. In his heart he knew that he had chosen rightly, yet in Denethor's eyes he had failed utterly. Gondor's peril sharpened, the enemy marched, and within the steward's house the fracture of love widened into chasm. Faramir, though noble, was unrecognized. Denethor, though mighty, was blind. Boromir, though fallen, was idolized. Together these threads wove the tapestry of Gondor's fate, a pattern of pride, humility, grief, and sacrifice. And as the shadow deepened upon the White City, a question lingered in the hearts of all who beheld the steward and his son. When the siege came, and ruin pressed against Gondor's gates, would Denethor's blindness consume them all, or would Faramir's quiet strength yet be revealed as the city's last hope? The halls of the steward grew darker as the shadow lengthened over Gondor. Denethor sat more often alone upon his chair, his eyes sunken, his face pale with sleeplessness. He walked seldom in the courts of stone, yet when he did, his gaze was fierce, as though he bore within it the weight of sights no mortal should endure. For the Palantir was his secret, and through it he looked eastward into fire and ruin. He saw the hosts of Mordor gathering in uncounted legions, saw the black ships of Umbar moving north upon the sea, saw the beacons of the world dim, and in his heart despair took root. He did not speak of the stone openly, yet all who dwelt near him felt the change. His voice grew harsh, his judgment colder, and his love, once reserved for Boromir, now soured into bitterness against Faramir. It was Boromir's death that broke him most, though even in that grief pride had its hold. He spoke of Boromir as though he were the last hope of Gondor, as though his fall had sealed the city's doom. Faramir's presence became to him not a comfort but a wound, a reminder of what he had lost. Where Boromir had embodied Denethor's own stern pride, Faramir seemed to him a contradiction, gentle where he sought hardness, merciful where he demanded ruthlessness, loyal yet unwilling to bend his wisdom to his father's will. Denethor did not see that in Faramir's gentleness lay Gondor's true salvation. His eyes were clouded, fixed only on the visions of ruin that the Palantir fed him. To his captains, Denethor spoke of inevitability. He told them that Gondor stood alone, that no help could come from Rohan, that no king would return from the north. He dismissed the tidings of Aragorn as rumor, mocking the claim of Isildur's heir. In the councils of war his words carried despair even as they commanded obedience. His captains obeyed, but unease grew among them. They looked to Faramir, who spoke with quieter voice, offering hope even when hope was small, urging patience, urging faith that Gondor's allies would not wholly fail. Yet Denethor silenced him, declaring that his son's counsel was folly, born of weakness. The rift between father and son widened in these days. Faramir bore it with sorrow, yet still he served. He rode out upon the steward's command, leading forays into Ithilien, though the danger was great. His men followed him without hesitation, for they trusted him with their lives. To them he was not weakness but strength, strength that refused to despair, strength that endured without breaking. Yet Denethor would not see it. When Faramir returned weary, having saved many but unable to stem the tide, Denethor met him not with gratitude but with scorn. "You bring me only losses," he said. "Would that Boromir were here, for he would not have failed me." These words pierced deeper than arrows, yet Faramir bowed his head and answered only, "I would not fail you, father. I do what I can." In the high chamber of the White Tower, Denethor sat at night with the Palantir before him, cloaked in secrecy. He saw the eye of Sauron blazing in its depths, and the Dark Lord showed him only what would crush his spirit. Endless hosts, endless fire, the inevitable ruin of Gondor. He did not know he was deceived, that the visions were bent to break him. He believed what he saw, and his heart hardened against hope. The more he gazed, the more he turned away from the living love of his son, seeking instead the memory of Boromir, whom he imagined still at his side. Faramir, though near, became to him almost invisible. Gandalf perceived the change, though Denethor gave him little heed. The wizard walked often with Faramir, speaking to him of strength that endures in quietness, of the dangers of despair, of the need to resist not only Mordor's armies but Mordor's whispers. Faramir listened, his spirit steadied, though he longed for a word of kindness from his father that never came. He loved Denethor still, for his heart was steadfast, but he saw the steward slipping further into darkness, bound by pride and poisoned by the stone he clutched. The people of Gondor murmured. Some pitied their lord, seeing in him a man crushed by endless burden. Others feared him, for his words grew harsh and his temper quick, yet they loved Faramir, whose gentleness remained unchanged even under scorn. In the streets, men spoke quietly. The steward grows old and weary, but his son endures. If only he could see the worth that all others see. Such whispers did not reach Denethor's ears, or if they did, they only deepened his bitterness. Thus Gondor stood upon the brink, her steward consumed by despair, her captain unacknowledged, her allies uncertain. The drums of Mordor drew nearer, and the skies darkened with storm. In the heart of the White City, father and son lived beneath the same roof, yet were separated by a gulf wider than leagues. Denethor saw only failure in the one who remained, blind to the strength that had saved Gondor's honor when temptation had come. And Faramir, though wounded, carried his duties still, for he believed that Gondor was worth any cost, even the cost of unreturned love. The madness of Denethor was not yet full, but its seed was sown. Each night with the Palantir drew him further into Sauron's snare. Each memory of Boromir's laughter became sharper, more bitter, until grief twisted into envy of death itself. And always beside him stood Faramir, loyal, enduring, unyielding in service, though denied in love. It was this contrast that sharpened the tragedy. The father who could not see, the son who would not falter, the city that waited for fire to fall upon her walls. The stage was set for ruin, though it had not yet come. Denethor's pride had become his blindness, his grief his madness, his stewardship a chain. Faramir bore the weight of rejection in silence, turning it into patience, turning it into wisdom. Yet in the days soon to come, when Mordor's armies surged across the Pelennor, that patience would be tested beyond endurance. And in the high tower of the steward, despair waited to burn like oil upon a fire, threatening not only the man who bore it, but the city entrusted to his care. Thus Gondor's fate hung suspended, balanced between the blindness of the father and the fidelity of the son. And as the night deepened, the question grew heavy upon every heart. When the siege began, would Denethor's despair consume them all, or would Faramir's endurance yet preserve what remained of Gondor's hope? The sky above Minas Tirith darkened, not with the passing of clouds, but with the gathering shadow of Mordor. A heaviness pressed upon the White City, as though the air itself labored under a weight too vast to bear. The beacons had burned across the mountains, their flames leaping in desperate plea, and the answer of Rohan was yet uncertain. In the east the hosts of Sauron moved, their banners black as ash, their countless feet shaking the earth. Gondor braced itself for siege, and the people huddled in fear, gazing upward at the walls and towers that had long seemed unassailable, but now felt fragile against the tide of doom. Faramir rode forth at his father's command to defend Osgiliath, that ancient city upon the river, once proud and beautiful, but now a ruin, contested in every age. Denethor sent him not with hope, but with bitter necessity, for in his heart he already despaired of victory. Boromir would not have failed, he said, sending his younger son into the teeth of the storm. Faramir bowed without protest, though the sting of those words pierced him more deeply than the enemy's steel could. His men followed him without hesitation, for their loyalty was not to Denethor's disdain but to the quiet strength of their captain. They rode through the city gates as the people watched, and though fear weighed upon every face, they lifted their hands in silent blessing. For in Faramir they saw not only Gondor's captain but Gondor's conscience, and their hearts went with him. The battle for Osgiliath was fierce beyond measure. The orc hordes poured from Mordor, blackening the ruins with their numbers, while fell beasts wheeled above, their cries shattering courage like glass. Faramir and his men fought in the streets of broken stone, on the banks of the Anduin, upon the shattered bridges that spanned the river. Time and again they drove the enemy back with arrow and blade, and Faramir was ever at the forefront, rallying his men with a voice calm but resolute. Yet the tide could not be stemmed. For every foe they felled, another came. For every street they cleared, another was lost. The city was consumed piece by piece, and the defenders fell in drove. Still Faramir would not yield. He held the line longer than any thought possible, buying time with his own strength and the lives of his men. The horns of Mordor sounded across the river, and the banners of the enemy covered the ruins like storm clouds. At last, with his forces shattered and his strength spent, Faramir gave the order to retreat. His men withdrew in bitter sorrow, carrying their wounded, covering each other step by step as the tide pressed upon them. Arrows fell like rain, black and merciless, and Faramir himself was struck, pierced by a dart of the enemy. His men lifted him from the field, bearing him back toward the city, his body broken, his spirit still unbroken. The gates of Minas Tirith opened to receive them, and the people saw their captain borne back, pale and near death. A cry rose across the city, not only of grief but of love, for they knew what he had given, what he had suffered, what he had purchased with his blood. Yet in the high chamber of the steward, Denethor looked upon his son with bitterness, seeing not sacrifice but failure. His grief for Boromir, twisted by despair, clouded every judgment. "Your brother would have stood and not retreated," he said, his voice sharp with accusation. Gandalf stood nearby, and his eyes flamed with sorrow and anger, for he saw that Denethor's despair had grown into madness. He commanded that Faramir be borne to the houses of healing, for his life still flickered though faint. Outside the walls, the siege began in earnest. Mordor's engines hurled fire and stone against the city, and the earth trembled beneath the march of countless feet. The white city shook under the blows, its towers cracked, its walls battered. The people cried out in terror as the sky itself turned black with smoke and shadow. Yet in the midst of ruin, the memory of Faramir's defense burned in their hearts, a small flame of endurance that even Denethor's scorn could not extinguish. The steward, however, turned wholly to despair. He sat in his hall like a man already entombed, his eyes hollow, his hands restless upon the arms of his chair. He trusted no ally, believed in no hope. To him Rohan would never come. The king would never return. Gondor was abandoned to doom. He looked upon his wounded son not with compassion but with bitterness, as though Faramir's near death were only proof of Gondor's ruin. "He is lost," he said, and his voice was as cold as stone. Gandalf rebuked him, yet Denethor turned away, clinging only to despair, nursing it like a flame that consumed him. Meanwhile the city groaned under assault. Fires spread, stones fell, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. The enemy pressed closer, their ladders rising against the walls, their engines striking with relentless fury. The people looked to the tower, seeking leadership, but their steward gave them none. It was the captains and Gandalf who bore the burden, rallying men where they faltered, urging endurance when all seemed lost. In the streets whispers passed of Faramir lying near death, and many wept, for they felt that if he were gone, then all that was noble in Gondor would perish with him. The houses of healing became a place of quiet battle, where the wounded clung to life, and among them lay Faramir, pale as winter, his breath shallow, his body burning with fever. The healers worked tirelessly, yet they knew that his wound was grave, and some said that only a hand stronger than theirs could call him back. Beside his bed, Gandalf lingered when he could, and the people prayed silently, not only for the city, but for the man who had come to embody its last unbroken spirit. Denethor, though, descended further into ruin. He looked upon his son and declared him dead already, though Faramir still breathed. Madness overtook him, and he spoke of fire and finality, of ending all in one last defiance of fate. The servants feared him, for his eyes burned with a fever brighter than any torch. In his despair he prepared to abandon not only his stewardship, but his son, his city, and himself. Thus the siege of Gondor pressed upon every heart. In the streets where the people cried, and endured on the walls where men fought with trembling arms. In the houses of healing, where Faramir battled for breath, and in the tower where Denethor's despair threatened to consume all. Gondor stood between ruin and hope, her fate balanced upon the thinnest of threads, as the roar of Mordor's armies shook the night. And yet, beyond the black horizon, riders stirred, horns lay ready to sound, and destiny moved quietly toward the White City. But within her walls, the question burned: could Gondor survive the madness of her steward and the wound of her captain long enough to hear salvation's call? The night deepened over Minas Tirith, and the White City groaned under the weight of fire and shadow. The towers shook with the thunder of catapults, and stones flamed as they fell, crashing into houses and streets. Smoke drifted upward, mingling with the blackness of the sky until no star could pierce it. The cries of the wounded filled the air, and still the people held fast behind their walls, for there was nowhere else to flee. Gondor stood at the edge of ruin, her walls battered, her defenders weary, her steward consumed by despair. In the houses of healing, Faramir lay pale and still, his body burning with fever. He stirred not when spoken to, his breath shallow, his spirit wandering in the borderland between life and death. The healers bent over him, whispering that his strength was failing, that no herb of the earth could recall him. Those who loved him wept quietly, for they felt that with Faramir the very soul of Gondor would pass. Yet Gandalf stood watch, his gaze grave, unwilling to surrender the young captain to the grasp of despair. Denethor, however, had already surrendered. The steward's eyes, hollow and burning, saw not hope but only ruin. He walked through the tower halls like a man already among the dead, speaking of fire, of ending, of denying the enemy even the satisfaction of conquest. His servants trembled before him, for he spoke now with the madness of one who has looked too long into visions of doom. He declared that Faramir was lost, that Gondor was abandoned, that no salvation would come. Better to perish in our own fire, he said, than to fall into the hands of the Nameless One. When Gandalf rebuked him, Denethor turned his grief into wrath. "You would supplant me," he cried. "You would rule in my stead, bringing false hope when hope is none. You would let my son linger in torment while the city burns. I will not have it. I am steward of Gondor, and none shall wrest my house from me." His voice echoed in the stone hall, terrible in its bitterness, and those near him dared not answer, for Denethor had resolved upon his last act. He would burn upon a pyre, and with him he would take his son. In the houses of healing, torches flared as Denethor's servants came, bearing orders to carry Faramir to the silent street. They lifted him gently, though he stirred not, and bore him through the stone courts toward Rathdinan, where the tombs of Gondor's kings and stewards lay in their cold silence. The people who saw them whispered in fear, for they knew the madness that gripped their lord, and they wept that Faramir, who had given all for Gondor, should be taken thus to a fiery death, while breath still lingered in his body. Denethor strode before them, tall and grim, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with fevered light. He carried a torch in his hand, and his words rang like iron. "We will end as we will," he said, "not as slaves, not as carrion for Mordor's hounds. My line ends here, and Gondor with it, better ashes than chains." His servants followed, though many trembled, unwilling yet too afraid to disobey. But Gandalf came also, swift and terrible in wrath, his white cloak billowing in the wind of his haste. Pippin ran beside him, crying out for Faramir, pleading that he still lived, that he must be saved. The clash of voices rose within the house of the stewards, firelight flickering upon the cold stone, as Gandalf confronted Denethor upon the steps of death. "You rule in madness," Gandalf said, his voice ringing through the chamber. "Your son still lives. Your duty is to defend your city, not to abandon it to ruin." Denethor answered with bitter laughter. "Lives? He lingers on the edge of death, and I will not watch him suffer only to fall into the hands of the enemy. You speak of duty, Mithrandir, but you know not the grief of a father who has lost all. Boromir was my pride, my joy, and he is gone. This one is left to me, weak and failing, a reminder of all that I have lost. I will not endure it. I will end it here." Then madness took him fully, and he commanded that wood and oil be brought forth, that a pyre be built within the house of his fathers. His servants obeyed, though their faces were pale, stacking the fuel and laying Faramir upon it as though he were already dead. The torch in Denethor's hand burned fiercely, casting shadows like phantoms against the walls. He prepared to cast it down, to consume all in flame, when Gandalf leapt forward, seizing the steward's hand. "Will you slay your own son who still breathes?" Gandalf cried. "Will you deny him even the chance of life? Is this the rule of Gondor, to abandon hope while hope yet remains?" Denethor struggled, his face twisted with fury, his voice a cry of anguish. "Hope? There is no hope. I have seen it with mine own eyes. The end is certain. I will not be made a fool by your false promises. I will not wait for doom. Let fire be my ending." In the struggle he broke free, and with a final cry, he cast himself upon the pyre, clutching the torch to his breast. Flame leapt upward, fierce and terrible, and the house of the stewards was filled with fire. His servants fled, wailing, as Denethor was consumed in his own madness, his voice echoing once more through the chamber before it was silenced forever. The pyre roared, and the last steward perished, taking with him his grief, his pride, and his despair. But Faramir was saved. Gandalf and Pippin drew him from the flames, bearing him swiftly from that place of death. His body burned with fever, his spirit flickered like a candle in the wind, but he still lived. They carried him back to the houses of healing, and there he was laid once more, to await hands that might yet recall him. Outside, the siege raged on, and the city trembled. Yet within her walls, a shadow had been lifted, terrible though its cost had been. Denethor, the last steward, was gone, undone by despair. Faramir, the son unacknowledged, lay between life and death, his fate yet uncertain. The people whispered of the fire upon Rathdinan, of the madness that had devoured their lord, and they turned their hope not to the house of the stewards, but to the captains who still fought, and to the promise of aid that might yet come. Thus ended the line of Denethor, And thus began the hour when Gondor's fate would rest, not in pride or despair, but in the endurance of those who remained. And while Faramir lay silent, the city endured, awaiting the dawn and the sounding of horns beyond the mountains. Dawn crept over Minas Tirith like a pale promise, its light veiled by smoke that rose in dark plumes from the ruined fields of the Pelennor. The city had endured the night, but it was a night of terror, filled with fire and blood, with the thunder of Mordor's engines and the cries of the dying. Yet as the first horns of Rohan sounded from the distant fields, faint but clear, hope stirred at last among the beleaguered people. They lifted their heads to hear the answering cry of riders, the thunder of hooves drawing near, and for a moment the darkness wavered. Still within the houses of healing, silence lay heavy, for Faramir's breath was faint, his body wasted by fever, his spirit lingering on the border between life and shadow. Gandalf, weary from battle yet tireless in purpose, watched over him. Pippin sat nearby, wringing his small hands, whispering prayers that seemed too fragile against the roar of war. The healers moved softly, speaking of herbs and poultices, but their faces betrayed doubt. "He is slipping," one murmured, "and no craft of ours can recall him. He wanders in a shadow that will not release him." Yet Gandalf, though grave, did not yield. "The hands of the king are the hands of a healer," he said quietly, as though speaking both to himself and to the wind, "and so shall the rightful king be known." At that hour, Aragorn came to the city, not as a claimant to the throne, but as a healer. He had ridden from the darkness with the Grey Company, and the sons of Elrond, bearing the weight of destiny upon his shoulders. He entered the houses of healing, clad in plain raiment, yet all who saw him felt a hush fall, for there was something in his bearing that stilled their doubts. He asked no ceremony, no heraldry, but went swiftly to the beds of the wounded. Arwen lay pale and cold, struck down by the black breath. Merry too lay near her, weary from his deed of valor, and beside them Faramir lingered, lost in fever. Aragorn's face was grave as he bent over the steward's son. He placed his hand upon Faramir's brow, feeling the heat of fever, the trembling breath, the faint pulse that flickered like a dying flame. "This is a man of great worth," he said softly. "If Gondor is to endure, he must be preserved. Yet his spirit is far away, wandering in shadows. He must be called back." At his word the healers brought a Thelas, the herb long forgotten by many, but still remembered in old songs. They crushed its leaves, and Aragorn cast them into steaming water. A fragrance filled the chamber, fresh and clean as though a spring breeze had entered the room, driving back the heaviness of despair. He leaned close to Faramir, speaking words that were both command and plea. "Faramir, son of Denethor, your city still has need of you. Do not wander long in shadows. Return." His voice was quiet yet strong, carrying authority that seemed to reach beyond the walls of the world. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the faint crackle of embers and the muffled cries of battle outside. Then slowly Faramir stirred. His breath deepened, his lips moved, and his eyes fluttered open. He gazed upward, his face pale but calm, and when he spoke his words were clear. "My lord, you called me. I come. For what would you have me do?" The healers gasped, and Pippin cried aloud in joy. Gandalf's face softened, relief breaking through his stern resolve. Aragorn clasped Faramir's hand, steady and warm. "Rest for now. You have done enough. Gondor will yet endure, and your part in her fate is not ended." Faramir closed his eyes again, but this time in peace, not in fever. Color returned slowly to his cheeks, and the shadow passed from him. The healers marveled, whispering that none had ever seen such a turning. Word spread quickly through the city. that the king had returned in the guise of a healer, and with him hope had entered Minas Tirith. Outside the battle roared, but within the houses of healing, quiet strength blossomed. Ardawen too awoke, her eyes opening to the light, and Mary stirred with a weary smile. The fragrance of Athelas lingered, and those who breathed it felt their hearts lifted, as though some burden had been eased. In that place of sorrow, life returned, and with it a new faith. The people began to whisper that perhaps the old prophecies were true, that the hands of the king would heal, and through healing, kingship would be revealed. Faramir's awakening was more than the saving of a life. It was the redemption of a house, for in him the line of the stewards endured, though Denethor had perished in fire and madness. Where his father had fallen to despair, Faramir had been restored through endurance. He awoke not to scorn but to honor, not to rejection but to the gentle hand of the king who was to be. Though he was weak, he smiled faintly, and those who looked upon him saw in his face the quiet strength that had always been his, now shining clearer than before. As the day lengthened, the horns of Rohan sounded nearer, and the clash of battle rang loud upon the fields. From the walls men saw riders breaking the siege, their white horsetails streaming, their lances lowered. The cry of Rohan, "Rohan has come," rose from the city, carrying with it a surge of courage. Yet still the battle hung in doubt, for the hosts of Mordor were many, and their captain terrible. But within the city hope had been rekindled, and that flame burned brighter than the fire of the enemy. Faramir slept in peace, tended by gentle hands, while Aragorn moved from bed to bed, giving strength where despair had lingered. The people whispered his name, though he claimed no throne. For in the hour of Gondor's deepest need, he came not with crown or scepter, but with healing, and that was enough. Thus the White City, though battered and broken, endured the day. The shadow had not lifted, but it had been pierced by light. The steward was gone, the madness of despair consumed, but his son lived, restored by the hand of the king. And in that living, the tale of the brothers found its resolution. Boromir, who had fallen in fire of battle and pride, and Faramir, who had risen through humility and endurance, together they revealed Gondor's heart, torn between ruin and redemption, yet preserved at last. The night would bring more trial, for the war was not ended. But for the first time in many days, the people of Minas Tirith dared to believe that dawn would return, and that Gondor's fate would not be written in ashes, for in the houses of healing, one had awoken who would guide her through sorrow into hope, and at his side stood the king who would lead her into a new age. And so the story of Gondor's brothers closed its circle, not in despair, but in the quiet endurance of life preserved against the shadow. The fields of the Pelennor lay silent at last, their grass trampled, their soil blackened by fire, their air still heavy with the stench of blood and smoke. The battle had ended, but its echoes lingered in every broken wall and every weeping voice within Minas Tirith. Victory had come, yet it was not without grievous cost. Countless lay fallen, from nameless farmers who had borne a spear for the first time to captains long seasoned in war. And among the wounded who lived, none bore a deeper mark of sorrow than Faramir, though his body was restored. For even as strength returned slowly to his frame, his mind carried the shadows of his father's last days, and the memory of Boromir's absence. Faramir walked the courts of the White City, still pale, leaning upon a staff, yet his gaze was steady, his steps measured. The people bowed to him as he passed, for they loved him more deeply now than ever. Knowing how nearly they had lost him, they whispered his name with reverence, calling him the quiet heart of Gondor, the son who had been spared when hope seemed gone. Yet in Faramir's own heart there was no pride. He thought of Boromir, of the horn that had sounded in vain at Amon Hen, of the broken body borne down the river, of the dreams his brother had carried for Gondor's salvation. He thought of Denethor, consumed by despair, and though the memory burned, still he grieved, for love does not vanish even when scorched by sorrow. It was in the houses of healing that he met Éowyn, pale still from her battle with Shadow, her spirit wounded as deeply as her body. Their meeting was quiet, yet something passed between them that neither sought nor resisted. Both had looked into despair and returned, scarred but not destroyed. Both had longed for love unfulfilled, for recognition denied. In one another they found not only solace but kinship, and in that kinship the first stirring of a hope that was more than survival. It was not yet spoken, but it lingered like a dawn not far behind the horizon. When Aragorn was crowned upon the fields before the city, Faramir was there, standing tall though still weak. It was his voice that first cried out, naming Aragorn as king, his words carrying through the throng like a bell long silenced, but now restored. "Behold the King of Gondor," he proclaimed, and the people answered with thunderous joy. In that moment, the long watch of the stewards ended, not in disgrace but in fulfillment, for Faramir surrendered not with bitterness but with gladness. The rule he gave was not wrested from him, but offered freely, and in that offering Gondor was healed as surely as Faramir himself had been. Aragorn embraced him, calling him brother, not servant. He confirmed him as steward still, not to rule in place of the king, but to stand beside him, guardian of the White Tower, and the memory of all that Gondor had endured. Faramir bowed, yet in his heart he felt not the sting of subjugation, but the peace of purpose. For the first time the burden of proving himself was lifted. He was accepted as he was, his worth recognized without measure against another's fire. In the days that followed, the city began to heal. Stones were set again upon the walls, gardens replanted, bells rung once more. Yet the memory of battle could not be erased, nor should it have been. For Boromir was remembered in every tale of courage, in every horn sounded upon the walls. His sacrifice, though marred by temptation, was honored for the love that lay at its core. The people spoke of him not as one condemned, but as one who had fought to the last for Gondor, whose fall had purchased time for the ring-bearer's quest to endure. Faramir himself led the remembrance, ensuring that his brother's name was not shadowed by his weakness, but lifted by his valor. Thus the tale of the brothers came to rest. Boromir, who had burned fiercely, too fiercely, and was consumed. Faramir, who had endured quietly and was preserved. Both had been tested by the same peril. Both had chosen differently, yet both had loved Gondor with unshaken hearts. In their contrast lay Gondor's truth, that strength alone cannot save, nor gentleness alone, but together they form a whole. The one was lost, the other spared, yet their stories wove a single thread through Gondor's fate. Often Faramir would walk the silent halls where his father had ruled, pausing before the empty throne and the steward's chair beside it. He would remember Denethor's fire, Boromir's laughter, and his own long years of quiet service. He did not dwell on bitterness, though pain remained. Instead he turned his heart toward the future, for Gondor had risen from shadow into dawn, and he was determined to guard her peace as he had guarded her walls. In the quiet of Ithilien he found rest at last. The land that had been scarred by war began to bloom again, its forests whispering with renewal, its streams running clear. There he made his home, not in the stone courts of the tower, but in the green places he had long defended. Beside him Éowyn walked, her laughter returning with the passing of sorrow. Together they built not only a dwelling but a life rooted in the healing of land and heart alike. The people who dwelt there loved them, calling Faramir not only lord but friend, for he ruled with gentleness, with justice, with humility. And though he carried the weight of his family's sorrow always within him, he bore it with grace. When the stars shone over Ithilien, he would look upon them and think of Boromir, whose fire had blazed and fallen, and of Denethor, whose pride had consumed him. He would not judge them harshly, for he knew too well the weight of temptation and despair. Instead, he honored them by living as they could not, steadfast, humble, and enduring. Thus the story of Gondor's brothers came to its close, not in the clash of arms or the roar of fire, but in the quiet triumph of survival, of endurance, of love renewed. Boromir's horn lay silent, but its echo remained in memory. Faramir's voice, once disregarded, became the steady note upon which Gondor's song was rebuilt. And in the end, the tale that began in pride and temptation resolved in humility and healing. The White City gleamed once more, her towers crowned with banners, her people unafraid. The line of kings was restored, the stewardship fulfilled, the shadow driven back. Yet in the hearts of the people, the names of Boromir and Faramir remained forever bound, forever contrasted, forever honored, for through their lives and their deaths, Gondor had been preserved. And so it was that the fate of two brothers, one lost and one spared, revealed not only the tragedy of men, but also their redemption. Their story lingered in song and silence alike, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, endurance may triumph over despair, and hope may rise from the ashes of ruin.